Sometimes, the most terrifying monsters are the ones living right next to you. My story begins when I moved to a new city for a job, excited for a fresh start. Little did I know, the apartment I found would become a nightmare. The city was bustling, full of life and opportunities. I found a cozy apartment in an older building on the quieter side of town. The rent was affordable, and the place had character: exposed brick walls, creaky wooden floors, and a large window overlooking a small park. I needed a roommate to split the rent. After a week of searching, I found someone who seemed perfect. Alex was in his mid-20s, just like me, working at a nearby tech startup. He seemed polite, responsible, and easygoing. We met at a coffee shop, and I felt a genuine connection. We agreed to move in together the following weekend. Moving day came, and Alex showed up with just a few boxes and a friendly smile. We unpacked, set up our rooms, and even shared a pizza that night, discussing our hobbies and interests. Everything seemed normal, almost too normal. But soon, small oddities began to surface. Alex would often come home late, sometimes in the early hours of the morning. His excuses were always plausible: late-night projects, meeting deadlines, but his erratic schedule started to concern me. One night, I woke up to strange noises coming from Alex's room. It was around 3 a.m., and I could hear muffled voices and a low humming sound. I dismissed it, thinking he was on a late-night call. But the noises became more frequent, and I started losing sleep over it. One evening, I decided to confront him about the late nights and the noises. Alex seemed genuinely surprised and apologized. He said he had been working on some audio projects for his job, which sometimes required odd hours. He promised to keep it down, and for a while, things seemed to improve. But my unease lingered. I began noticing more strange behavior. Alex would sometimes disappear for days without a word, only to return looking exhausted. When I asked him about it, he would brush it off with vague answers. It felt like he was hiding something. Then came the night I couldn't ignore. It was a stormy evening, and the power had gone out. I was in the living room, reading by candlelight, when I heard the humming again. This time, it was louder, almost as if it was coming from inside the walls. I followed the sound to Alex's room. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see a faint glow coming from inside. I called out his name, but there was no answer. Pushing the door open, I found the room empty, except for a laptop on his desk, screen flickering. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached the desk. The laptop was running some sort of program, lines of code scrolling rapidly. I had no idea what it meant, but it felt unsettling. I noticed a folder on the desktop labeled Projects. Against my better judgment, I clicked on it. What I found was a collection of documents and surveillance photos. They showed Alex in various locations around the city, watching people and taking notes. There were detailed files on several individuals, including me. He had documented my daily routines, my habits, and even my conversations. The last file was the most disturbing. It was a plan outlining steps to isolate me from friends and family, to manipulate and control my environment. The level of detail was chilling. He knew more about my life than I did. Panic set in. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. The storm outside raged on, and the power was still out. I knew I had to leave. I packed a few essentials and headed for the door, but just as I reached it, I heard the front door open. Alex stood there, drenched from the rain, a blank expression on his face. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then, without a word, he stepped aside, as if allowing me to pass. I didn't hesitate. I ran out into the night, not looking back. I went straight to the police, but by the time they arrived, Alex was gone. His room was completely empty, as if he had never been there. The laptop, the documents, everything had disappeared. To this day, I don't know what Alex was planning or why he chose me. I moved out of that apartment and never looked back. But sometimes, late at night, I can still hear that low humming sound, echoing in my mind. So, If you ever need a roommate, be careful. You never know who you might be inviting into your home. Looking for a new place to live in a big city is always stressful, but finding the right roommate can be even harder. My story begins when I moved to a new city for a job. The city was known for its high rent and competitive housing market, so I was lucky to find a decent apartment with a reasonable price tag. The only catch? I needed a roommate to share the cost. I posted an ad online, and after a few days of screening candidates, I met Jake. He was in his late 20s, like me, working as a freelance graphic designer. He had a friendly demeanor and seemed genuinely nice. We met at a local coffee shop, and after a brief conversation, we hit it off. We agreed he would move in the following weekend. Jake moved in with minimal fuss. He had a few boxes and some basic furniture. We spent the first night chatting about our lives, interests, and work. He mentioned he was a bit of a night owl, often working late into the night on his projects. It didn't bother me since I was usually exhausted from my day job and fell asleep early. Things were great initially. We shared chores, respected each other's space, and even hung out together on weekends. But soon, small peculiarities began to emerge. Jake's late-night work sessions became more frequent and intense. I'd often wake up around 2 or 3 a.m. to the sound of him typing furiously on his computer or talking quietly on the phone. One night, I woke up to hear him speaking in a low, urgent tone. It sounded like he was arguing with someone. I couldn't make out the words, but the intensity was unsettling. The next morning, I asked him about it. He brushed it off, saying it was a difficult client from a different time zone. I accepted his explanation, but the unease lingered. A few weeks later, I started noticing more odd behavior. Jake began receiving packages almost daily. They were small, unmarked boxes that he quickly took to his room without opening them in the common areas. Whenever I asked about them, he gave vague answers about supplies for his work. Then, one particularly stormy evening, the power went out. I was in the living room, reading by flashlight, when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps above me. We lived on the top floor, and there shouldn't have been anyone upstairs. The noise continued for several minutes, then abruptly stopped. I was on edge, but I tried to rationalize it as an effect of the storm. The next day, curiosity got the better of me. I mentioned the noises to Jake, who seemed genuinely puzzled. He suggested it might have been the building settling or an animal on the roof. His calm demeanor reassured me, but I decided to pay closer attention. One evening, Jake was out, and I took the opportunity to peek into his room. I know it was an invasion of privacy, but my instincts told me something was off. His room was surprisingly bare, except for his desk, which was cluttered with various electronic devices and wires. There were no personal items, no decorations, nothing that indicated someone lived there. It felt more like a temporary setup than a home. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying everything in my head, trying to piece together the puzzle. Around 2 a.m., I heard the front door open. I quietly got up and peeked into the hallway. Jake was standing there, drenched from the rain, holding another one of those unmarked packages. He didn't notice me and went straight to his room. I decided I needed answers. The next day, I took off work and waited for Jake to leave. Once he was gone, I went back to his room, determined to find out what was in those packages. I found a small knife on his desk and used it to carefully open one of the boxes. Inside were various electronics components, nothing too suspicious on their own, but together, they seemed odd. As I was examining the contents, I heard the front door open. Panic set in. Jake was home early. I quickly put everything back, closed the box, and dashed out of his room, closing the door quietly behind me. I tried to act normal, but my mind was racing. That evening, I confronted Jake. I told him I had accidentally knocked over one of his boxes and saw the electronics components. His reaction was unexpected. He calmly explained that he was working on a project for a new client who required specialized equipment. He showed me a website and documents to back up his story. His explanation was so thorough that it almost convinced me. But I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was terribly wrong. That night, I called a friend who worked in tech security and told him everything. He agreed to come over the next day to take a look. When my friend arrived, he did a quick sweep of the apartment and found nothing out of the ordinary. However, he suggested I keep an eye on Jake and look for any further suspicious activity. The following week, Jake's behavior became even more erratic. He would leave suddenly in the middle of the night and return hours later looking disheveled. One night, I decided to follow him. He left around midnight, and I waited a few minutes before quietly trailing him. He walked several blocks to a small, run-down building and disappeared inside. I waited outside for what felt like hours. When Jake finally emerged, he was carrying a large duffel bag. He walked back to our apartment, and I followed at a safe distance. Once inside, he went straight to his room. I waited for him to fall asleep, then crept into his room to inspect the bag. It was filled with more electronic parts and some handwritten notes in a language I couldn't decipher. The next morning, I contacted the police. I told them everything, and they agreed to investigate. They found that Jake was involved in a series of burglaries across the city, using his skills to disable security systems and steal valuable electronics. He had been using our apartment as a base of operations. Jake was arrested, and I was left to process the shock of living with a criminal. The experience taught me a valuable lesson. Be careful who you trust, especially when it comes to sharing your home. You never truly know who you might be living with. I'd always been cautious about sharing my living space, but moving to a new city for work left me no choice. The rent was too high for a single income, so I had to find a roommate. I posted an ad online, specifying that I wanted someone quiet, responsible, and employed. I got a lot of responses, but one stood out. His name was Mark. Mark was in his late 20s, like me, and worked as an IT consultant. He seemed normal enough, friendly, clean, and with good references. We met at a coffee shop to discuss the details, and he seemed genuinely nice. He moved in a week later, bringing just a few boxes and a laptop. At first, everything was great. Mark was tidy, paid his share of the bills on time, and kept to himself. We had a few chats here and there, but mostly we lived our separate lives. He often worked late, and I was usually in bed by the time he got home. It was an ideal arrangement, or so I thought. About a month into our living arrangement, I started to notice little things. Mark was very secretive about his room. He kept the door locked, even when he was home. One night, I heard him talking on the phone in a hushed tone. It sounded intense, but I couldn't make out any words. I brushed it off, figuring it was just work-related stress. Then, strange things started happening. I'd come home to find the front door unlocked or a window open. At first, I thought I was just being forgetful, but it happened too often to be a coincidence. I asked Mark if he'd noticed anything, but he shrugged it off, saying I was probably imagining things. Still, the uneasy feeling lingered. One particularly chilly evening, I came home to find Mark sitting in the dark, staring at his laptop. He looked up at me with a strange expression before quickly closing it. I asked if everything was okay, and he forced a smile, saying he was just tired. Something about the way he looked at me sent a shiver down my spine. A few days later, I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. I assumed it was Mark coming back from a late-night snack run, but when I listened closely, the footsteps seemed to be moving back and forth, almost pacing. I got up to check, but by the time I opened my door, the hallway was empty, and Mark's door was closed. The next morning, I decided to talk to him about it. He laughed it off, saying he must have been restless in his sleep. His explanation didn't sit right with me, but I let it go. Over the next week, the strange noises continued, footsteps, whispers, and once, the sound of something being dragged across the floor. One weekend, Mark told me he was going out of town for work. I saw this as a perfect opportunity to get to the bottom of things. Once he left, I decided to look around his room. I know it was an invasion of privacy, but I needed answers. His room was surprisingly neat, almost too neat. There were no personal items, just a bed, a desk, and his laptop. I hesitated, but then I opened his laptop. It was locked with a password. Frustrated, I started looking through his drawers and found a small notebook. Flipping through it, I saw pages filled with names, dates, and addresses. My heart raced as I realized the dates matched the nights I had heard the noises. The names and addresses were unfamiliar, but I had a sinking feeling they weren't random. As I stood there, trying to make sense of it, I heard the front door open. My blood ran cold. Mark was supposed to be out of town. I quickly put the notebook back and left his room, closing the door quietly behind me. I slipped into my room and listened. I heard him moving around, then the sound of his door closing. I spent the rest of the night in a state of high alert, every creak and groan of the apartment making me jump. The next morning, I called in sick to work and went to the police with the notebook. They took it seriously, saying they had been looking into a series of burglaries in the area and that Mark fit the profile of their suspect. That evening, I came home to find Mark gone. All his things were packed up, and there was no sign of him. The police told me later that he had been using our apartment as a base to scout and plan his crimes, using his job as a cover. They found evidence linking him to multiple burglaries and arrested him a few days later. The experience left me shaken. The realization that I had been living with a criminal all those months was terrifying. I moved out of that apartment and decided to live alone, no matter the cost. It taught me a valuable lesson: trust your instincts and be careful who you let into your life. You never truly know who you might be living with.